going to cover the cardiovascular system. Really, we're going to talk about, move into the actual anatomy and physiology of the cardiovascular system, not just the blood. We're going to go over the anatomy of the heart, right? So this will actually mirror what you covered in lab last week, right? In preparation for your lab exams this week. All right, the slides you see up here are going to be less in number than what you have in front of you. I'll talk about all the stuff that's written on there. I'm just not going to, list the valves and everything else. That's all on some textual slides that you have. So you have like 55 slides. We'll cover 25 or so in here. Okay? All right, but the other ones are just text. So this is a posterior, anterior view of the chest showing you where the heart is. So this area right here is the heart, okay? And it kind of points to the left on the patient, right? The heart sits in this whole area, which is called the mediastinum, and is found within the thoracic cavity. And the heart is surrounded by the lungs. That's what you see, the black area, right? Pay no regard to whatever that is. Our lovely radio diagnostic imaging students, does that look completely normal? No, it does not, right? There's a slight mass right where that is and should not be there, okay? So the cardiovascular system is composed of the heart and the blood vessels, right? And the function of the cardiovascular system is to transport material, to transport blood, right? And to move the blood then, right? Then also transports oxygen, carbon dioxide, nutrients, hormones, etc. Okay? The cardiovascular system also helps in regulating blood pH, body pH, helps regulate water balance, all right? And it really integrates all of the systems together. Okay, so if you think about any of the systems, the cardiovascular system integrates with it in some way, right? With the nervous system regulates heart rate, okay? With the renal system, right, the cardiovascular system integrates with the kidneys and help regulate blood pressure and water balance, right? With the skeleton, right, the blood is actually composed in the skeleton altogether, right? So we have lots of integration that happens. The heart is the main organ of the cardiovascular system, okay? It drives the movement, it provides the force of movement of blood throughout the system, and the vessels carry that blood around, okay? The vessels, 3 types of vessels, and we'll talk about these again, right? Arteries, veins, and capillaries. Arteries carry blood away from the heart. A for away, easy way to remember that. And most of the time, carry oxygenated blood away from the heart. Veins carry blood towards the heart, and most of the time, carry deoxygenated blood. And then capillaries allow for exchange of gases, of materials, and that's why they're kind of like that purpley color where you go from red to blue, right, while oxygen is unloaded in tissues. For color-coded purposes, I did it in red and blue, okay? And for your pictures that you will see in the models in lab and pictures in lab and in your textbook, the vessels are colored red and blue to indicate oxygenated and deoxygenated blood. Most of the time, that will indicate arterial is oxygenated or red, and venous blood is deoxygenated and blue. Most of the time. There are some exceptions. Come on. So, the heart, right, is a 2-sided pump. All right, it's composed of 4 chambers, 2 sides separated by a lovely septum that is continuous from the atria through through the ventricles. All right, there's 4 chambers that make up the heart, 2 on the right and 2 on the left. Okay? Your right side of the heart is actually shaded here in blue, indicating what type of blood? Deoxygenated. All right, so this circuit, right, is the pump for the pulmonary circulation, and that's why that blood will be pumped out towards the lungs to be oxygenated. And then it comes back, this figure doesn't show it, but actually the blood comes back from the lungs via the pulmonary veins, empty into the left atrium to left ventricle, and then out through the aorta, right? This is the aorta out to the body. So your 2-sided pump, blood on the left does not mix with blood on the right. Okay, that allows for separation of deoxygenated and oxygenated blood. I want you to understand this. The goal or the requirement standard for the heart, the job of the heart, is to perfuse tissues. What does perfusion mean? Perfusion is the delivery of blood to provide oxygen and pick up waste. Okay? So each of us has a certain demand of blood that has to be pumped out of the heart, delivered to tissues in order to meet the metabolic demands of those tissues. Okay? So at the very lower limit, the very least, the minimum amount of perfusion is what you do when you're sleeping. Okay? Or you're like bare minimum. So lowest heart rate and delivering tissues or delivering oxygen to tissues, picking up waste, right? That's the bare minimum. Any activity you do above that increases the standard or the requirement that the heart has to deliver. Does that make sense? So if you work out 3 times a day and you burn a bunch of calories, great for you, your heart is consistently working, right? So activity, exercise helps keep the heart healthy by keeping the pump being efficient. Does that make sense? Okay. When you disrupt that and you prevent perfusion, the heart has to work harder. Examples would include blockages of arteries, right? Problems with the heart, pumping blood out, right? Valve issues, etc. All right, so you have 2 sides and then eventually 2 circuits. The heart has a number of vessels associated with it, what we call the great vessels. We have the aorta, what I just talked about, that's this one in red, okay, and delivers blood from the left ventricle, right, to the body. Your superior vena cava and your inferior vena cava deliver blood to the heart into the right atrium. All right? And then you have a couple other vessels. The pulmonary trunk picks up blood from the right ventricle and will deliver it out to the lungs. Right? So the pulmonary trunk, portion of the portion of a vessel that leaves the right ventricle and then splits into right and left pulmonary arteries. And then you have your pulmonary veins, which bring oxygenated blood back from the lungs into the left atrium. All right, so those are your great vessels. Questions on general structures of the heart? The 2-sided pump. So we separate sides, left and right, in order to separate oxygenated blood, deoxygenated versus oxygenated, right? To keep that separate. The efficiency of the pump also depends upon one-way directional blood flow. We always want it to come in and then go out. Okay? We don't want it to slow down too much. We really do not want it to go backwards. Okay? In order to maximize and prevent backflow, the heart has two sets of valves. Okay? You have two atrioventricular valves, or AV valves, one on the left, one on the right. The tricuspid valve on the right, or your right AV valve, and on the left is your mitral or bicuspid valve. Okay? Those valves prevent backflow of blood from the ventricle to the atrium. So when they're closed, right, blood does not go from the ventricle to the atrium. When those valves are open, blood can flow from the atria into the ventricles. Okay? Always from one direction. It never goes from it should never go from ventricle to atria. If it does, that's a physiological problem of the heart. Okay? And there's a number of different conditions where that does occur. Okay? Our second set of valves are what we call semilunar valves, based upon their structure. Right? They are kind of like half moon shaped. Okay? Hence the semilunar naming. And one is on the aorta, separates the aorta from the left ventricle, so it's the aortic semilunar valve. And the other is on the right side of the heart and separates the pulmonary trunk from the right ventricle, so it's called the pulmonary semilunar valve. You also call pulmonary valve and aortic valve, they're the same thing. All right? You don't necessarily have to have that semilunar in the name. Okay? So you see these are kind of structured like half moons, right? And the way they work is blood is pumped from the ventricle into the vessel. And when it does that, it causes the valve to push open. Okay? So as blood moves in, it forces the valve open, and as that happens, the speed or the velocity of blood as it moves through starts to slow down. Okay? And in terms of gravity-wise, how is this direction of blood moving? Right? We know that this is inferior, right? And this is superior. So that directional flow right there is opposite or opposing gravity, right? So as it slows down, guess what happens? That blood starts to flow back. Do we want that to happen? No. So what happens? Blood flows in and kind of inflates these semilunar valves. So when they inflate, they return back to their closed position, they balloon open, and they become closed. Kind of like a parachute, right? So kind of like parachutes catches air. In this case, those semilunar valves catch the blood as it's returning backwards, fill up, and they close off so that doesn't go all the way back. Yes?
Does some blood come back through?
A little bit does, right? So this is what we call, the blood that's pushed out of the ventricle is what we call ejected, right? So it's like pushed with a hard force because of the way that the pressure builds in the ventricle. So it overcomes the pressure in the aorta and forces that valve open, like pushes it open really fast. And then as it starts to come back, it closes again. So very little blood actually flows back because of the force of ejection that's there. So two types of valves, AV and semilunar valves. Here are your pulmonary and systemic circuits. All right, the pulmonary circuit starts at the right atrium. All right, so the right side of the heart, right atrium, right ventricle, goes out to the lungs. Okay, and then comes back from the lungs to the left atrium. Okay, so from right atrium to left atrium is your pulmonary circulation, or your pulmonary circuit. And then from left atrium to right atrium, okay, as blood goes out to goes out the aorta to the body, right, to the superior and inferior, and comes back through the superior inferior vena cava. That is your systemic circuit. Pulmonary, right side to the lungs, and then as it comes back from the lungs, left side is your systemic circuit. Left atrium out to the body, and from the body back to the right side of the heart. So it is a one-way group, one-way pathway, right? Two circuits based upon the two-sided nature of the heart. For lab, you should be able to follow and lecture. You should be able to follow a drop of blood through the circulations in general. Questions? Here's your pulmonary circuit. Actually, written it down right there. Right, so from right atrium all the way back to the left atrium. It actually has every one of the things that you should know on there. Right AV valve, right ventricle, semilunar valve, pulmonary trunk, pulmonary arteries, the lungs, left and right pulmonary veins to the left atrium, and then there's your systemic circuit. Left atrium, left AV valve, left ventricle, aortic semilunar valve, aorta, systemic arteries, quote unquote, the body, comes back from the body, superior vena cava, inferior vena cava, the coronary sinus, which is part of the heart, we'll see in a little bit, and then enters the right atrium. That is your pulmonary versus systemic circuit. Okay? I would really encourage you to be able to write that down for lab and lecture and know where you're at. All right? And also identify, most of this is in pink, right? So systemic circuit, most of the systemic circuit has oxygenated blood except for the systemic veins, superior, inferior vena cava, because oxygen has been dumped. Okay? And most of the pulmonary circuit has deoxygenated blood because it's going to deliver that blood out to the lungs and return it back to the left atrium. Questions? All right, so the heart sits within the thoracic cavity in the area of what we call the mediastinum, right? That is this area in here, the area in the middle of the lungs. That outlined part is the mediastinum, okay? The mediastinum technically is like this square where the great vessels are, right? So on the superior aspect of the heart, the superior aspect of the heart is called the base. So up here's the base, and the little point at the bottom, that is the apex. Position-wise, it sits underneath the ribs, right? So maybe about the level of the fourth rib, top of the heart, right? The apex actually sits right on the diaphragm, the separation between thoracic and abdominal cavities. Okay? The heart, the apex of the heart points to the left, and the inferior and inferiorly and to the left. Okay? That positioning of the heart is a direct result of the development of the fetus, right, during pregnancy. Right? That's a genetic thing, and disruptions of that there are conditions where that is flipped, where all of the organs are placed in the body in a certain way, and that's a result of the development of the fetus, right? So heart to the left, lungs over here. There's a condition where that's flipped, and then now the lungs, the right lung is actually supposed to be on the right side, is actually on the left side, and everything's flipped inside, right? So now the stomach's on the right instead of the left, etc. Right? So it's like an inversion of all of the organs. Why is it important to know that? Think of you as like practitioner, you meet a patient for the first time and you go and put the nice cold stethoscope on them and you don't hear a heart sound. That's weird. Or you hear it really muffled and not strong when you put it on the left side of the heart, upper chest. Why? Well, it's over here. That's important to know. Does that make sense? There are, people who have that condition are most of the time quite normal. There are some abnormal complications that are involved with it as well. So, but within the thoracic cavity, the heart sits within a special part called the pericardium, right, or the pericardial area, pericardial cavity, right? The pericardial cavity and the heart is encased within the pericardium. The pericardium has two different parts to it, a fibrous part and a serous part. The fibrous part sits on the outside, holds the heart in place, and actually attaches the heart to the diaphragm. Okay? So you have a fibrous pericardium on the outside. Okay, and you can see it's in purple here. It's on the outside and actually holds the heart in place on the diaphragm. Okay, that's the fibrous pericardium. The serous pericardium actually has two layers. And the two layers are separated by a fluid-filled space called the pericardial sac. Okay? The serous layers produce serous fluid, which allow for the heart to beat and help to reduce friction along the place where the heart's moving. Okay? So for that, and you can see this, you have the parietal layer of the serous. That covers, actually I'll do it in a different color here. We'll do it in pink. Right out here, that's your parietal layer, and then the visceral layer is in green, right? So the visceral layer in green is actually the surface of the heart itself, right? So visceral pericardium is equal to the epicardium. Same thing. Okay, or the surface of the heart itself. So fibrous layer holds the heart in place. Actually is kind of made up of mostly connective tissue. Actually provides kind of a volume limit to what the heart can take up. Then you have the serous pericardium, which has two layers. Parietal, outside or the ins or of the outside of the cavity, and then the visceral pericardium, which covers the heart itself. Between those layers is filled with serous fluid. The analogy that your textbook and a lot of textbooks give is imagine your heart is about the size of your fist. Take your fist and put it into push into a water balloon. Right? Does that make sense? A water-filled balloon. And you push the heart, you push down. Now that balloon kind of engulfs around your hand, right? Okay. What's engulfing around your hand, that layer of latex or of the balloon, is your serous visceral pericardium. All right? The fluid inside the balloon is the pericardial fluid. Then the outer part, the outer layer of latex is your parietal pericardium. visually, if that makes sense to you. So, what's the purpose of that serous fluid? Helps to reduce friction. The heart continually beats, okay? And if there's friction that happens, it can cause irritation, right? So that friction, so think about the epicardium is made up of epithelial tissue. It rubs against another one. Now the epithelial tissue becomes inflamed, and now that inflammation then puts pressure on the heart itself, okay? That inflammation is called pericarditis, okay? So inflammation of the pericardium, and it can be caused by a number of different things, one of which is a virus. That's probably the more common cause. All right, you have bacteria or even fungi, right, can cause infections, can cause pericarditis. So inflammation of the pericardium leads to increased fluid, and then that puts pressure on the heart, okay? This leads to increased capillary permeability. So the capillaries become leaky. When they become leaky, that means more fluid is going to come out of those blood vessels and accumulate around the heart. Too much fluid around the heart means the heart can't relax completely because of the pressure around it, okay? And it can't fill with blood adequately. So when it pumps next, it pumps and pushes that volume of blood out. Now, because of the pressure, it's contracted, it can't relax and open up all the way and refill with blood. Does that make sense? Okay, so every time with that added pressure, the amount of blood leaving the heart is reduced. So what does the heart have to do? Because your standard doesn't change, right? The goal is still perfusion. You have to deliver oxygen and blood to tissues. The tissues aren't going to change the demand. Does that make sense? So what does the heart have to do? It has to beat faster. It has to work harder. So increase heart rate and increases force of contraction. That puts more pressure on the heart. Okay? And that might cause some pain to go along with it. Okay? So the fluid accumulates and that restricts the heart's movement, keeping the chambers from filling, right? Results in something called cardiac tamponade. The heart is unable to pump and it leads to a distinct sound or murmur, or clicking, right? What we call a friction rub, a crackling sound heard with the stethoscope as those layers rub together, and also leads to problems with ECGs, right, or EKGs. Right, so the conduction parts of the heart are going to be changed as well. What's the treatment? So so I try to put this picture in there. Oh, there's better. Right, so picturing here to show you the difference. Normal heart on the left, pericardium, plenty of space. Pericarditis, heart on the right, pushes pressure on the heart. You can see the difference where the heart cannot relax completely, fill with blood, and then push all of that blood out. Okay? What we're talking about is what we call cardiac output. Your body has a certain need for cardiac output. Cardiac output is a result of how fast the heart beats every minute, so your heart rate, and how much blood is pumped out every time the heart beats. And we'll talk about that in like a week and a half. Right? So cardiac output. If you don't meet the standard, we have to do something to meet the standard. If only 40 milliliters of blood is pushed out every heartbeat, and normally it's 80 mils per beat, right? Your heart activity is diminished by about 50%. How do we make that up? Increase heart rate by 50%. So you go from like a normal 60 to 70 beats per minute to 80 to 90 beats per minute. Make sense? So, how do we treat it? It's an inflammation. How do you treat inflammation? Talk about it. First off, how do you treat inflammation? Discuss. 20 seconds. Go.
You can't raise the heart above the heart. Oh.
Technically, you're not wrong because cardiac tamponade, right, is usually one symptom is pain, right? So it hurts when they're laying down. The pain is usually alleviated when they sit up or they lean forward for whatever, because of the way the heart is filled. But how do we treat the inflammation? Inflammation in general doesn't have to be just this. So, question, how do we treat the inflammation? How do we treat inflammation in general? In general, Caitlin, anti-inflammatory. So your first line of defense would be non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs or steroids, which will help reduce the inflammation. A lot of times, the pericarditis resolves around by itself. Okay, so it will heal after by treating the symptom. Virus gets processed by the body, right? Goes away. A lot of times that happens. What happens if we can't treat the inflammation? How do we, if this is really severe and the buildup of fluid is really pushing on the heart?
I don't know, you need to get a drainage.
You have to get it drained, right? So the problem being the risk of what's called a pericardial effusion. An effusion is a ripping of the tissue and the fluid leaves, okay? But really what you need to happen is to reduce the amount of fluid inside the pericardial sac, right? So you have a pericardial centesis. You take a needle, go through, right? That's help a radiologist goes through and drains the fluid around the heart. That helps relieve the pressure, relieve pain, allows the heart to pump more efficiently. Questions on the pericardium? All right, so here are some features of the heart. External anatomy, we just went over the blood vessels. All right, so pulmonary arteries, some special features. The heart has, on the outside, over the atrium, are what we call auricles, right? So you have a right auricle and a left auricle. Where is it? Left auricle of the left atrium. The atria is in a building is an open room that people come into and they start to congregate there. Same thing happens here. Blood comes into the heart and enters the room. That's an atrium, okay? Now, there are times, and this is really great to have for your heart to have this capacity, that more blood than normal comes back to the atrium from the body or back from the lungs than, quote unquote, normally happens. So your heart has a capacity to accept more blood by the auricle kind of expanding. And that's what it is. It's kind of like this wrinkled tissue up top that allows a little bit excessive, right? Think of it as an elastic waistband on your stretchy Thanksgiving pants. We all know those, right? Right? So it allows a little bit of an expansion. Okay? So blood can come back. From there, blood enters the ventricles and then is pumped out of the body. Right? The heart, apex, base, great vessels, right? We have our superior vena cava, our inferior vena cava. The aorta is also broken up into different parts. The first part that goes up, that's the ascending aorta. And then we have the arch, right? That's the aortic arch is the bend, okay? Which then leads into the aorta going down behind the heart, and that's your descending aorta. Goes down through the thoracic cavity, through the diaphragm, through the abdomen, becomes the abdominal aorta, then splits into left and right iliac arteries, right? And then goes into femoral arteries. The heart itself is a prioritized tissue. Like the brain, the heart needs a consistent, rich blood supply. By rich, I mean filled with oxygen, filled with nutrients that is present for it to do its job, right? Which is to beat and push more fluid through it, okay? So the heart is prioritized in that the blood vessels that go to the heart tissue, come right off the aorta.
How can you tell the difference between the auricle and the atrium?
Technically, the atrium is the inside opening. The auricle is the tissue that's on the outside of the heart. So on the surface, right, this, on the surface here, that's the auricle. So it's a kind of a wrinkly tissue. The atria is the chamber or the area, the open area inside the heart. Okay? So why don't the ventricles have auricles? Well, the ventricles have a bunch of muscle that is going to push blood out. We don't want the ventricles to expand, right? We need them to contract and eject blood, right? The auricles can expand to accommodate for more blood to come back. So like I was saying, the blood vessels that deliver blood to the heart come right off the aorta, and those are coronary arteries, right? So here you can see a number of different coronary arteries. One that comes down, that's your anterior interventricular artery between the ventricles. You have the circumflex, which is in the coronary sulcus and goes around the back. Then you have the right coronary artery that breaks into some other ones that's also in the coronary sulcus. Coronary sulcus is an indent where that blood vessel is going to reside. Here's what it looks like under a cadaver heart. The color's gone. How do I know what's what? Well, you kind of have to figure it out. You have to identify the blood vessels, right? Apex, is going to point to the left. The blood vessel that's most anterior is the pulmonary trunk. So this one is in front of the curved one. This one, curved one, is the aorta. So this is your pulmonary trunk. This is the aorta. And then you have the other structures based upon there. Okay? On the posterior, we can see a number of different vessels, right? Similar to the ones that we saw in the front. So we're going to have coronary artery. We're going to have cardiac veins, which bring blood from the heart back to the most prominent feature, which is the coronary sinus. All right, so here is the coronary sinus. Collects blood from the cardiac veins coming back from the heart and then empties into the right atrium. And here you can also see pulmonary veins, 4 of them, which then will empty right into your left atrium, which is right underneath there. Questions on the structures of the heart? Most of this is going to be due in lab. You will see it on your lecture exam as well. All right, and here is your cadaver heart picture. Right, so left atrium is this whole thing. Right, and over here behind it, that's your coronary sinus, which would empty into the right atrium, along with the inferior vena cava that would be right there. Questions? Some other clinical conditions that related to the heart in terms of anatomy of the heart. teenage athletes and sudden cardiac death. This is becoming more, I don't want to say more prevalent, but it is being prevalent. Also, there's some evidence to support that vaccines for COVID have some association with COVID vaccines in teenagers, leading to myocarditis, right, and cardiomegaly, which is an increased thickness of the heart muscle. Okay, so most of the time, this is due to congenital heart defects that are unnoticed, right? Coronary artery anomalies that occur that are largely unnoticed until athletes are put under, the heart is put under a level of stress, okay? So cardiac thickness of the heart, symptoms include swelling, dizziness, arrhythmia. What's arrhythmia? A regular heart rhythm, right? So that could mean the atria contract before the ventricles, right? Or the atria contract after the ventricles contract before the atria. Something is happening, right? Maybe the one atria is contracting without the other one. Lots of different things, right? And because there's arrhythmia, thickness of the heart, right? The heart pump is not delivering blood efficiently. When it doesn't deliver blood efficiently, guess what your body does? It feels like it's short of breath. Because you can't get oxygen out to the tissues enough, so I can't catch my breath, right? You're trying to load oxygen. Your body's literally trying to load oxygen on the blood and then deliver that blood to tissues, right? Your nervous system is getting the information from your tissues saying, we need more oxygen, but your heart can't meet that need, right? So it feels like I'm out of breath, right? But the reality is the heart pump isn't working. The delivery system is disrupted, okay? And that can be read by X-ray and confirmed by ECG or echocardiogram, right? The heart wall is made up of 3 layers. The outer layer is your epicardium or the visceral pericardium, same thing. Beneath the visceral pericardium is the myocardium. The myocardium is the structures made up of cardiac muscle, all right, which contracts. Now, cardiac muscle, you'll see it here, mostly cells that are uninucleated. They have one nucleus. So here's one cardiac muscle cell outlined in green. It has one centralized nucleus, okay? It also has, you'll notice these things, light red. Those are striations. Cardiac muscle is striated. What do we also note about cardiac muscle? Is it voluntary or involuntary? Luckily, it's involuntary, okay? So involuntary, striated, uninucleated. This cell here is branched, means it has a couple different connections. And so it's going to connect, let's say, to this cell here. And also we'll connect to, let's do it in a different color. It'll also connect to this cell here. Okay, so we have a number of different connections. Okay, and then the boundaries between cells are unique, right? The boundaries in black are the connections between cells. Right, some examples of those. Right, those are specialized junctions that allow the cytoplasm from one cell to flow or be continuous with the cytoplasm of another adjacent cell, so that a change in ion concentration in one cell is transmitted directly into the next cell. All right, and allows this whole tissue to function kind of as one. That's important, right? We want all of these muscle cells, cardiac muscle cells, to contract at once, so that the heart pump is the most efficient it can be. Okay, those connections are called intercalated discs. That is what makes up the myocardium. So the level, the tissue, that layer that is going to contract and pump blood through the heart. And then the most inner layer of tissue is the endocardium, which is made up of simple squamous epithelial tissue. And that endocardium, it lines the interior parts of the chambers and also helps line the interior of blood vessels. So the endocardium is made up of endothelial cells, simple squamous epithelium, and your blood vessels are lined by endothelial cells as well. Questions on the heart layers? One defining characteristic of the myocardium is there's a difference between this, what's this right here called? This middle part. Caitlin.
Say it again.
Yeah.
Interventricular septum.
The interventricular septum, the area between the ventricles. Inter means between, ventricular, ventrals, septum. This area in blue is the what? What is it between? The atria. That's your interatrial septum. Right? So you have this, remember we have two sides. Okay? The epicardium is going to be out here on the outside. Right? Epicardium. The myocardium is in here in the muscle. And what do we know about the left ventricle wall versus the right ventricular wall? So here's the left ventricular wall shaded in red there, and then you have the right ventricular wall, which is that. So this whole thing is the myocardium of the left ventricular wall versus the myocardium of the right. It's thicker. Why is the myocardium of the left ventricle thicker than the right ventricle? Not Caitlin. It has to pump blood to the entire body. And to do so, it has to produce a lot of pressure, which then pushes blood through your vessels. That's why you have distinct blood pressure, right? And delivers blood out to all of the capillaries. And actually helps push blood partially back to the heart through the veins. Okay? And then your endocardium is the lining of the vessels, the chambers. It's on the inside. Questions on the layers of the heart wall? Dun, 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 dun. All right, so on the interior surface, we know we have valves, right? We're going to look at some special structures inside the heart, right? So we have right atria, right ventricle, left atria, left ventricle. The valves, what's the purpose of a valve? Prevent backflow, right? So the valves, atrioventricular valves, are subjected to a very high pressure when the ventricles contract, okay? So during a normal heartbeat, at rest, before your heart starts to beat, all right, before a heartbeat is initialized, the atria are relaxed, the ventricles are relaxed, the AV valves are open, and blood is flowing into the atria directly into the ventricles, okay? Okay. Then your electrical impulse fires, the atria contract and push more blood, all of what's inside the atria at that point, into the ventricles. Okay? At that point, then, that electrical impulse moves through the heart and now initiates the ventricles to contract. The ventricles start contracting, and when they contract, it pushes these valves closed. Okay? At that point, you end up with what's called isovolumetric pressure increase. Right? Isovolumetric contraction. The ventricles continue to contract. Isovolumetric means there's no change in volume. So whatever blood's in the ventricles is staying. What happens when those ventricles start to push in, the pressure inside builds up. Right? So that pressure builds up. We have high pressure in the vessels, but we have low pressure in the atria because the atria just pushed all of the blood into the ventricles. Right? So if that were the case, pressure builds up. We're going to go from areas of high pressure to low pressure. That would push as the ventricles contract, that would push blood into the atria. But the valves are there. And structures of the valves have these kind of anchor points, we call chordinae tendineae, that attach to muscles inside the wall of the ventricles called papillary muscles. Those papillary muscles kind of hold on, anchor those chordinae tendineae, and as the pressure builds up inside the ventricles, prevent the valve from flapping open and pushing blood into the atria. Okay? So you have the chordinae tendineae and the papillary muscles that allow that to happen. Chordinae tendineae, tendinous cords are the same thing. Okay? Both sides happen. What happens if the valves prolapse and they're not strong enough and it opens back?
Blood is going to go the opposite way.
And if blood goes from the ventricle to the atria, where is it not going?
Well, if it's supposed to go to the lungs, then it's not going to become oxygenated.
Yeah. So no matter where it's supposed to go. So if it's, depending on what side we're talking about, right? Let's say the right side, because you said the lungs. So blood should go from the right ventricle out to the pulmonary artery, right, to the lungs. But if it's going to go back to the right atrium, part of it's going to go back to the right atrium, some's going to go out to the lungs, but that's not going to be enough for our normal perfusion. So what happens to the overall amount of blood that's pumped out of the heart? It's reduced. That makes the heart work harder. Does that make sense? And if it's only one side of the heart, well then blood's not good. There's a backup that happens, and then you end up with what's called pulmonary edema, right? Or systemic edema. Blood gets backed up somewhere. Okay? Now, in the right atrium, a couple other things. You have this indent right there. You guys can see it in blue. That's called the fossa ovalis. That is a remnant of a hole that closed either just prior to or soon after birth. Okay? It's a remnant of the fetal blood circulation. That blood comes into the right atrium from mom, who just did all the oxygenating, right, of that blood, comes into the right atrium and then is shunted from the right atrium to the left atrium to the left ventricle inside the fetus. Right? What do we know about the fetus versus a newborn? They're breathing from themselves. Right? So a newborn, blood needs to go from right atrium to right ventricle. So that hole, that foramen ovale closes, and your fossa ovalis is what's left over. Okay? And then another part of the fetal circulation is the ligamentum arteriosum, right? Which was a connection between the aorta and the pulmonary trunk, also a remnant of the fetal circulation. And we'll talk about that when we go through the fetal circulation in a couple weeks. There's valves. We went over valves, left and right, bicuspid, tricuspid. and the pulmonary semilunar valves. This also is a relation to what we call the fibrous skeleton of the heart. The heart is made up of muscle cells that have to hold on to something to contract, right? The valves are part of the fibrous skeleton, made up of fibrous tissue, connective tissue, right? That provides support for the muscles to contract on. Okay, so we have your AV valves, your semilunar valves, and how they kind of work. Went over those already. Papillary muscles, coordinate tendinae, chambers, valves flow. What is important clinically about the valves? How do we diagnose a problem with the valves? Non-invasive diagnosis of a problem with the valves. So, stethoscope to look for a lub dubs, or let's just say heart sounds. Okay? A normal heart sound is what we call the lub dub. The first heart sounds are your valves closing. Okay? So it should be something two sounds should be normal. The first sound, lub, hard. Okay? Hard first sound. Why is it hard? Because the AV valves are closing and they are snapping closed, right, due to the pressure of the ventricles. They are large valves that close tight. They have to close tight so that that vessel, that blood under high pressure doesn't go back to the atria. Does that make sense? Okay? Your second sound, a little softer. Those are your pulmonary your semilunar valves, aortic and pulmonary, closing. A little bit softer because they close based upon the pressure difference between ventricle and vessel. And blood starts to flow backwards and then they close. They don't necessarily snap close. All right? The two sounds, the lub dub, are sound one, sound two. They should be together. Okay? That should be two sounds. Boom, 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 boom. Right? There are times, what would it sound like if AV valves didn't close at the same time together? So your AV valves are your sound one. Right? What if it was your sound one is now two sounds. That make sense? Because one AV valve is closing before the other one. What does that do? That's a heart murmur. It's what's called a split first heart sound. So if the valves don't close at the same time, what does that do to the pathway of blood? Well, they're not closing at the same time, so the amount of blood that's moving through the heart in the normal flow of traffic is messed up. Okay? So you can end up with some backup on one side or the other. Okay? You could also split the second heart sound. So instead of, you have see the difference? Now you have a split second heart sound. Okay? And that also leads to problems with blood flow. The valves are still closing. There's no backflow of blood, but it's not the right continuous movement. There's two other heart sounds, S3 and S4, that are clinically important. That has to do with the movement of blood through the vessels, right? But you don't really hear them lub-dub are more important, right? So a heart murmur is an abnormal heart sound, and that's a result of turbulence of blood passing through the heart. When the valve is not closing correctly, the movement of blood causing like a whooshing or a whirling sound inside. Think about when you drain a bathtub, right? Sometimes it goes through. You hear movement of water through pipes because water makes sounds as it moves through, okay? The two types of heart murmurs are valvular insufficiency and valvular stenosis. So problems with the valves are heart murmurs, lead to heart murmurs, abnormal sounds. Valvular insufficiency is where the valve doesn't close completely, right? It doesn't stay closed. Something's happening, right? Cardiac valves are leaking. Perhaps the cusps are not closing tightly, especially the bicuspid and tricuspid, not closing all the way. So blood is kind of pushing back where it's not supposed to be, which could lead to a heart enlargement. Why would that lead to a heart enlargement? Think about what's happening. I'm going to and focus more on AV valves in this case. Why would that lead the heart to be enlarged?
Because they have to pump more blood.
Because they have to pump more blood. Still have to meet the perfusion needs of the body, right? Whatever the tissues need, the heart has to deliver. But if the heart isn't pumping all of the blood in the ventricles out into the vessels, some of it's going back to the atria, it has to work harder to meet the perfusion needs of the body. So that heart gets bigger, right? Can lead to other issues. And then valvular stenosis. Stenosis is a thinning. All right, so the area of the valve gets thinner. How does that happen? The valve cusp becomes scarred. It can't open completely. So they don't open all the way, so the area or the opening becomes reduced. Less area or for the blood to flow through, less blood goes through, right? We're kind of pinching the vessel and the valve. So that presents resistance to flow. That reduces the chamber output, right? And therefore the chamber may enlarge and dilate to help increase the amount of blood coming in to meet the needs going out. Does that make sense? So the valves prevent backflow, but they help maximize what we call cardiac output. Okay? And so cardiac output is mathematically equal to your heart rate multiplied by what we call stroke volume. Okay? That's the stroke volume is the amount of blood pumped out of the heart every beat. Okay? So our body has a distinct cardiac output. Think about at rest, your heartbeat maybe is like, let's say it's 60 beats per minute. Okay? And your stroke volume at rest is probably like 70 mils. Okay? So multiply those together, that's 4,200 milliliters per minute. 4 liters of blood through your heart every minute. That's at rest. Okay? That's what the bare minimum of that your body needs at rest. Okay? If I increase metabolism through exercise, what happens in exercise? When you exercise, what happens to your heart? It beats faster. So guess what? During exercise, your heart rate goes up to 100 beats per minute. That's pretty good exercise. Well, what else happens? Does your heart beat harder? Yes? Guess what also happens? Your stroke volume goes up. Let's say it goes from 70 up to 100. Multiply those two together. 1, 2, 3, 4. 10,000. That's probably a little high, but you get the idea. That make sense? Right? Because the needs of your body are increased. Your perfusion needs are increased. Your heart has to alter and change to meet those needs. Right? We'll talk more about cardiac output and what it means in about a week. Okay?